The name Ralph Leroy Menzies has haunted Utah for nearly 4 decades. Convicted of the horrific murder of Maurine Hunsaker, sentenced to death by firing squad, yet still alive after 37 years of appeals. Now the courts face one final question. Is he too far gone to be executed? The answer could change the future of the death penalty. Subscribe to my channel and watch the full story to uncover the truth. Let's begin. On a cold February night in 1986, Utah was about to witness one of its darkest crimes. Maurine Hunsaker, a 26-year-old mother-free, stood at a quiet Kearns gas station, unaware that danger was only steps away. She was young, vibrant, and deeply loved by her husband and children, but fate was about to deal a cruel hand. Out of the shadows emerged Ralph Leroy Menzies, a man whose name would soon be etched into Utah's criminal history. In an instant, Maurine's life took a horrifying turn. She was kidnapped at gunpoint, her last moments of freedom stolen in the blink of an eye. Hours later, in a desperate bid for survival, she managed a brief phone call to her husband. Her trembling voice carried both fear and hope as she whispered, "I've been robbed and kidnapped, but he says he'll let me go soon." But those were the last words her family would ever hear from her. The line went dead. Silence filled the receiver. And with that silence came the beginning of a decades-long nightmare that still haunts Utah to this day. 2 days later, searchers stumbled upon a chilling scene in Big Cottonwood Canyon. Bound to a tree, Maurine's body told a story of unimaginable cruelty. Her throat slashed, the marks of strangulation leaving a permanent scar on her family's memory. This was no random act of violence. It was a calculated, brutal killing that shattered a family and left Utah communities reeling in shock and fear. The murder of Maurine Hunsaker was more than a crime. It was an act that ignited nearly 4 decades of legal battles, moral debates, and emotional pleas for justice. From the moment her body was found, all eyes turned to one man, Ralph Leroy Menzies, the suspect who would soon become the longest-serving inmate on Utah's death row. But what drove him to commit such horror? And why? Almost 40 years later, is his name still dominating courtrooms, headlines, and public debates about the death penalty in Utah? This is not just a story of murder. It is a story of a family's fight for justice, a state's struggle with execution methods, and a haunting question of whether justice delayed is justice denied. And yet, as the years dragged on and as appeals mounted, one thing became chillingly clear. The fight over Ralph Menzies was far from over. But what happened when the case went to trial? And why did the sentence spark one of the most controversial death penalty battles in Utah history? The discovery of Maurine Hunsaker's body in Big Cottonwood Canyon sent shockwaves through Utah. Her brutal murder was not only a tragedy for her family, but also a wake-up call for the state. The man accused of this unspeakable act, Ralph Leroy Menzies, faced a justice system ready to uncover the truth. In March 1988, after 2 years of investigations and mounting evidence, Menzies stood before a Utah jury. The courtroom was heavy with grief, as Maurine's family relived a night that tore their lives apart. Witnesses recalled the chilling details of her kidnapping, the last phone call to her husband, and the horrific way her life had ended. The evidence was overwhelming. The jury found Menzies guilty of first-degree murder and aggravated kidnapping, and the sentencing phase began. But in a startling move, Menzies chose not to let the jury decide his fate. Instead, he handed the responsibility to the judge, placing his life in the court's hands. On March 23, 1988, justice came down like a hammer. Menzies was sentenced to death, becoming one of the most notorious inmates in Utah's history. Unlike many others, he made a chilling decision. He chose execution by firing squad, one of the most controversial and debated methods of execution in the United States. For Maurine's family, the sentence brought a measure of relief, but it was far from closure. They believed that justice had been served, yet they knew that years of appeals and legal battles lay ahead. Little did they realize that those battles would stretch on for nearly 4 decades, testing not only their patience but the very definition of justice in America. But as the death sentence was handed down, Menzies and his legal team began a relentless campaign of appeals that would keep him alive for decades. How did one man manage to outlast execution dates again and again? After the 1988 death sentence, many believed that Ralph Menzies' time was running out. But the reality was very different. Through a web of appeals, stays, and court rulings, Menzies became Utah's longest-serving death row inmate. In 1992, the Utah Supreme Court upheld his conviction and sentence. In 1994, it again rejected his appeals. Even when a death warrant was issued in 1995, it was stayed pending further legal reviews. Each delay meant more years of anguish for Maurine's family, who had to relive the trauma every time the case resurfaced in the headlines. Year after year, Menzies remained behind bars at the Utah State Prison, aging but alive, while Maurine's children grew up without their mother. To them, justice felt frozen in time. By the 2000s and 2010s, debates over Utah's death penalty system intensified. Critics questioned whether keeping inmates on death row for decades served justice or undermined it. Supporters argued that men like Menzies deserved the ultimate punishment, no matter how long it took. As the decades passed, the case transformed into a battle between justice and delay, between the memory of Maurine and the legal protections afforded to her killer. And just as the family thought the end might finally be near, another twist changed everything. Menzies' health began to deteriorate. How could a man once deemed fully competent to face execution now become the center of a heated national debate over dementia, competency, and the death penalty? By the early 2020s, Ralph Menzies was no longer the same man who had terrorized Maurine on that February night in 1986. Now in his late 60s, he was a shadow of his former self, wheelchair-bound, relying on oxygen, forgetful, and often confused. Doctors diagnosed him with vascular dementia, a progressive condition that stripped him of his memory and reasoning. His attorneys seized on this, arguing that executing a man who no longer understood his punishment would violate the 8th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which forbids cruel and unusual punishment. They claimed he could not comprehend why the state of Utah wanted to kill him. The courts faced a difficult question. Should a man's deteriorating mind spare him from execution, even after he brutally ended another's life? Supporters of Menzies argued that society should not kill someone who no longer understood reality. But Maurine's family fiercely disagreed. They remember Maurine tied to a tree, her throat cut, and her life stolen at only 26. To them, dementia did not erase the horror of her murder. They believed Menzies was still the man who had destroyed their family, and he deserved to face the punishment he chose: the firing squad. In June 2025, after intense legal wrangling, a Utah judge declared Menzies competent to be executed. For the first time in decades, Maurine's family felt that closure might finally be within reach. But as the execution date drew closer, a new legal twist reignited the storm. Just when Utah was preparing for its first firing squad execution in years, the state's highest court stepped in, halting the process in its tracks. The execution was scheduled for September 5th, 2025. Utah was bracing for one of its most controversial executions in history. But on August 29th, 2025, the Utah Supreme Court stunned the state by vacating the execution warrant. The justices cited serious and significant questions about whether Menzies truly understood his punishment. They ordered a new competency evaluation, effectively pausing the countdown to his death. For Maurine's family, it felt like another cruel twist in a saga that had already lasted nearly 40 years. Each time they thought justice was within reach, it slipped away again. Her children, now adults with families of their own, expressed frustration and exhaustion. They had been forced to live their lives in the shadow of legal battles that seemed endless. The stay sparked outrage among those who supported the death penalty, while opponents of capital punishment saw it as a victory for human rights. Across the nation, headlines once again debated Utah's use of the firing squad and whether executing a man with dementia was morally defensible. But while the courts debated, Maurine's family gathered to make their voices heard. And what they said revealed a deep divide, not only in Utah, but within the family itself. Today, nearly 40 years after the murder of Maurine Hunsaker, the case of Ralph Leroy Menzies remains one of the most controversial in Utah history. Once a young man convicted of a brutal crime, he is now an elderly inmate suffering from dementia, sitting in a wheelchair, waiting for the courts to decide his fate. The state of Utah stands at a crossroads. On one side, prosecutors argue that justice for Maurine demands that Menzies face the firing squad he once chose. On the other, his attorneys argue that executing a man who no longer understands his punishment is a violation of human rights and the Constitution. For Maurine's family, the decades of appeals have been agonizing. Some want closure through execution, others through forgiveness. But all agree on one thing. The pain of losing Maurine has never gone away. Her children grew up without their mother. Her husband lived his life with an unfillable void, and her grandchildren know her only through stories and photographs. The case has become bigger than one man, one family, or one state. It has ignited national debates about the death penalty in America, the use of the firing squad, and whether a justice system that takes decades to enforce a sentence can truly be called just. As the courts deliberate, one haunting question lingers. Will Ralph Leroy Menzies ever face the punishment handed down in 1988, or will he escape death through the passage of time and the deterioration of his own mind? The answer remains uncertain. And until it comes, the memory of Maurine Hunsaker, her stolen voice, her stolen life, remains the beating heart of a story that refuses to end.